Our next panel is a very important and timely topic, facilitating legal immigration. Our speaker is Ted Chiapperi. Ted is with Duane Morris and is the head of the firm's immigration law practice group, representing companies seeking to acquire temporary work permits or permanent resident status for their foreign employees. With that, Ted, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Shannon.
Before you start, Ted, Nima Sander was supposed to join us, but something's come up on the
Yes.
medical side.
Yes. So I'd like to start out maybe somewhat counterintuitively. I don't see real reform in increasing or improving legal immigration options without first meaningful steps on securing our border. So I'd like to spend some time on what that could look like, securing our border, so that as a community, as a country, as a nation, we can get comfortable with figuring out how to increase or improve the legal immigration system that we have. And ultimately, it's going to be some big ideas maybe, and then maybe some small steps that I think are realistic in the coming years of this administration. So IRCA from 1986, the grand compromise that the Reagan administration pulled through, really only addressed one pull factor, employment in the United States. It ignored most of the other pull factors. It also ignored the push factors as to why people want to come to the United States. As a number of panelists previously and eloquently said, the United States is a great place. And we're a victim of our own success. We've got political stability. We've got economic prosperity. When you have parts of the world falling apart or facing persecution or something less short of persecution, oppression, the United States becomes an attractive place. This is obviously a hard task. When preparing for this, besides identifying the push factors here, I went through, and since 1986, administrations of both parties have gone through a lot. We've really tried to crack the nut on securing our border. We're not an island nation like Singapore, where we can just close. We've got two of the largest land borders, and we've got nations that want to be independent and have their own political and domestic agendas. Having those sorts of dialogues with our neighbors and friends can be complicated and difficult. But we've taken a lot of steps on restricting the pull factors. We had IRCA, which addressed the employment. The Clinton administration tried to address the social safety net features, made it a lot harder for immigrants to acquire access to welfare. On the education side, education is a function of the states, so the federal government can't really restrict it all that much. They did try on the visa side to make it difficult for tourists here to come and enroll in school. And then on family relations, there are minor steps to try to, there's an annual quota for family visas. There's legislation on marriage fraud. And I know there's an employment and labor conference, but there are only 140,000 visas allocated per year for employment visas. There's 226 for family-based. Immediate relatives are unlimited. So a good chunk of the immigrants that come to the United States are here for reasons other than employment. And they obviously become an important part of our workforce. And securing our borders, the current president in his first term really tried to build a physical wall that proved to be challenging for a lot of reasons, financial, logistic, political. This administration, he's pivoted to building a virtual wall, making the United States as unattractive as possible to potential immigrants and discouraging them from coming that way. And it's had a lot of success. There's a lot less volume at the southern border. So there's some truth to that. Airport security, I think, is a true success story after 9/11. What we were able to do with securing our air travel is impressive, but that's a lot easier to do with airlines than it is with geographic borders. I'm going to skip discouraging overstays for a moment. Collaboration with neighbors and allies, we've had collaboration. Various administrations have tried to work with the Mexican government to figure out ways to discourage migration across Mexico. I think there's room for more collaboration to push the decision-making to the southern part of the Mexican border, or possibly down to the Panama Canal. It's a much easier physical border to control. Obviously, that involves real political engagement and treatment of our neighbors on the North American continent as equals and partners. And there are also political, linguistic, and social challenges to that approach. And then influencing the push factors. One of the things I would like to invite us to consider is how much investment in political stability and economic development in other countries would reduce or eliminate the push factors that motivate people to come to the United States. So rather than just looking at it as foreign aid that gets squandered, really look at it as an investment in securing our borders. We've taken a lot of steps to discourage overstays. There was concern about overstays going back at least to the hostage crisis in 1979, where people realized we had no system to figure out who's in the United States. SEVIS has been a real success in deputizing universities to take responsibility for the foreign students here. You don't have to have an ICE agent come and look for students. Generally, the universities and colleges are doing their job to make sure that students attend school, take the courses they're supposed to take, and if they're not, then they report them and arrange for their departure. The USA Patriot Act has done a lot for making it a lot harder for undocumented workers to have a financial existence, an economic existence in the United States. Very difficult to get a real Social Security card. Real ID Act, this is an example of the tension between employment security, trying to control foreign nationals in the United States who aren't authorized to be here, and a strong historical tradition in the United States to resist a national ID card. The libertarian, free spirit bent in the United States sees some real issues with having the federal government have that much access and control over our identity. I think in some ways the cell phone revolution has made Americans a lot more comfortable with having their Face ID, their fingerprints accessible online. Whether that's actually going to soften the libertarian bent enough to have us warm up to a national ID card where everyone's got a federally issued card that allows us to do whatever we need to do, I don't know. But I-94 security, that's the document. Yes, it's online now, it's electronic, but there's still no meaningful way to stop people from overstaying their visas in most contexts. And the notion of, and Randy's going to roll his eyes here, the notion of deputizing all employers who are looking to employ foreign nationals by having an employer-based SEVA system, I think would just, most employers would just roll their eyes and say, well, unfunded mandate, how are we going to afford this? And the big employers might do that if they have a high volume of foreign nationals, but most will just say, okay, we just can't do it. Similarly, you could have a SEVIS-like system for landlords to address tenants, hotels to address tourists. Again, I don't think there's much appetite for that, but it would be a way to figure out how to track I-94 overstays. Another idea, and these are sort of the big ideas that I don't think are going to go anywhere, requiring employers who do complete I-9s actually to turn them in to the government and have them audited, similar to filing a tax return. So far, we've relied on the honor system, and again, I'm not sure there's much appetite to go beyond that. In terms of rethinking the notion of secure borders, if the quotas were higher, if it were easier to come in, there'd be more compliance. The more, it's counterintuitive, but if there were an essential worker visa where you didn't have to prove the job required a bachelor's degree and you needed X years of experience, then there would be a greater legal flow that would be allowed and would presumably reduce the flow of illegal immigration. Again, I don't see that happening until we actually have a meaningful control of our borders. But it's something to think about in terms of how to redefine what we understand as a secure border. I just want to get some underlying philosophical questions that show just how hard it is to address this question: who belongs? I think most people would agree that a fundamental notion of sovereignty is that a country does need to control its borders. But when you ask the question, who belongs, that's a much harder question as to whether race, nationality, demographics, economic status should be factors that should be considered in that analysis or not. Another way of asking that is, what are we afraid of, or who are we afraid of? Why do we not want these people in our community, or who in our community are we trying to protect? And then, in addition to who and what, how do we want to enforce our laws? I think most of us in this room care about due process and want to have a fair hearing. But how much discretion do officers get? Discretion is a two-edged sword. If you have clear rules, only A, B, and C are allowed in, then there's no discretion. And a lot of people are going to be left out. But if you leave discretion to the examiner, then it becomes arbitrary, or can become arbitrary. And then, as other panelists earlier today talked about, we're in this with a certain legislative inaction has fostered executive action, and that's resulted in a bouncing back and forth, including in the immigration area, which has then put burdens on the judicial system to control that. So I think at some point the ball is going to land in Congress's court, and it's going to be up to Congress to act. So if we do come to some agreement on controlling our border security and get comfortable with it, then I think there may be some room for lawful immigration options. And again, I think there are some administrative and judicial actions it can take, but it's ultimately going to be, with the legislature. Only Congress can reduce statutory restrictions, so the numerical quotas that are currently in place can only be lifted by Congress or increased by Congress.
These are statutory restrictions on green cards?
Green cards and also temporary work visas.
What are those restrictions?
So there's 140,000 work-based visas per year that are granted for permanent, and there's also a 7% per country limitation on those, which has resulted in Indians and Chinese having a much longer wait for the green card than other
So
nationalities.
the green card as a permanent card?
Yes.
The reason I actually thought of this segment, because I've run into, in my short life and career, at least 25 people who tell me they have applied for green cards. They're working, notwithstanding the Reagan compromise. They want green cards. How can we facilitate that process? I understand you'd like to enlarge the cap, and we should do that, right? Unless you disagree. I mean, you said you like immigration, so we want to increase lawful immigration.
I
Is that
think,
wrong?
I think increasing lawful immigration is going to actually enhance border security.
Right, so I'm in favor of that, right.
Yeah.
So we want to increase the cap, but we have an existing cap. What can be done to help working people navigate this system so that actually they get a resolution within a reasonable period of time? What are the agencies doing with these applications? Tell me.
So the estimate is that there's somewhere between 12 and 15 million unauthorized workers in the United States.
Okay.
On top of those unauthorized workers, you've got people who are beneficiaries of humanitarian parole. That's roughly 500,000 Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans. Could be a little bit more. You've got a couple 100,000 Ukrainians here on humanitarian parole. The current administration has,
We have a lot of undocumented aliens in this country.
yeah.
Now, the question is, what can be done to facilitate lawful immigration? What can be done with these agencies? Because it's a terribly long period of time, I understand.
So one of the the quickest fixes would be, there's a provision of law that says if you've entered the United States without inspection, you cannot adjust your status or regularize your status in the United States. That combined with a law that says if you've stayed in the United States for more than a year without authorization and you leave the United States, you subject yourself to a 10-year bar. So at this point, you've got several million, maybe more than 10 million people who have entered without inspection and have been here for more than a year and who can't leave without the fear that they're going to be outside the United States for 10 years, and so they'll never come back. So those people have every incentive to go underground and just be part of the underground economy and not come forward. And there are very few avenues for relief unless you're married to a U.S. citizen.
But am I wrong in my perception, and I'll quit, that it takes an enormously long time for these immigration agencies to resolve these applications? Because you're saying it's just a size problem. I think it is a size problem, but it's also an agency inertia problem, as far as I can tell. Am I wrong?
That's not the main reason for why these people don't have their green cards. The U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which followed in INS's footsteps, has always had a history of robbing Peter to pay Paul in order to deal with resource shortages. But that's not the problem today. Yes, things do take longer than people care for, but there are interim solutions for that. They get temporary work permits. The real problem is how do you crack the nut of the 15 million, and how do you get them regularized without it being treated as considered to be an amnesty, where, okay, we let these 15 million in, we give them green cards, and then the next bunch just keep coming in from outside the U.S. And we don't want to repeat that mistake again that happened in the 80s.
Thank you.
I think these are, if I may, these are the issues like that just sort of defied, Congress from ever reaching a comprehensive immigration deal and for decades now, and Randy, I know, has the scars and can speak to that. But, you know, I think your comment about essential workers is very important because, you know, on this spectrum of visa programs, on the one end is, you know, very much high-tech, plentiful supply, right? And on the other end, basically unlimited for ag workers and H-2Bs, seasonal temporary employment. But in the middle, along that dotted line, you know, really especially for service sector, I think that it's just, there's a huge void. And so it really is incumbent upon Congress to come up with some sort of solution. There's one piece of legislation that we've been advocating for many years in the business community, and that's the creation of an H-2C program. And that's a bill sponsored right now by Congressman Smucker, Lloyd Smucker, who is in the construction industry, really kind of understands and appreciates the need for something like that. But moving a visa worker program bill.
What would the H-2C entail?
It would essentially be, it would test the market, and it would be very much like an H-2B, but it, you know, depending on the labor force participation, I think this goes to the gentleman's point before, you know, the cap would go up or down. And it would be essentially start at 85, like the H-2Bs, and it would fluctuate depending on what the needs of the market is. There's also great portability with that program in that, you know, worker comes in, is not necessarily wedded to this particular employer the entire time, can move around within the market as long as there's. So, I mean, it's creative. It's a creative solution. Unfortunately, you know, there's just a huge lack of interest right now on the Hill. And my understanding is there may soon be an NPRM from the administration, depending on what happens with budget reconciliation, of prohibiting work permits for asylum seekers. And that would, you know, really kind of exacerbate this whole situation, I think.
Well, and I think there's a strong move to try to adjudicate the asylum applications as quickly as possible, presumably denying most of them so that they don't even get into the fabric of the country.
Yes.
I know we're running out of time, so I'm
We
going
are.
to skip the various factors on legal and
Yep.
just give a couple of ideas I think that are doable in the next year or so. Replacing the current I-9 system with E-Verify for all employers. I think that would go a long way to allay the concerns that the current system is ineffective. E-Verify gives access or accesses Social Security data and USCIS data and allows employers who are enrolled in E-Verify to get government verification that that the person's authorized to work. And I think if we replaced the paper-based I-9 system, that would just raise the confidence level of Congress a little bit more. And then I'll skip the H-2B since you mentioned that. Religious workers are facing a time bomb. The R1 temporary work visa is only valid for 5 years. And up until 2021, it was fairly easy to get a green card for religious workers, but then the State Department reinterpreted how the quota gets calculated for them, and now there's a wait that's longer than 5 years. So the Catholic Church is probably the church, the religious institution that's most affected, but you've got a lot of these people who at the end of 5 years have to leave the country for a year before coming back in. And that would be a fairly easy fix for the current administration, just to undo the Biden administration's interpretation of the statute. I'm not quite sure why that hasn't happened yet, but that would be a realistic fix.
Well, we are at time. We don't really have time for questions, but I'm sure you're going to stick around. And so if anybody has follow-up questions, just talk to Ted.
Thanks,
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.